Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters on France 24. Coming up on this week's show. With the country in the grip of its worst ever economic crisis, election officials in Egypt say voters will go to the polls for a presidential ballot in December and not as expected in the spring of 2024. Families living in abject poverty in northwestern Syria make the heartbreaking choice to forgo education for their children and send them out to work. And water scarcity in Iraq has already displaced thousands. With temperatures rising and river levels falling, lives are increasingly at risk as industrial, chemical, medical and biological waste flows untreated into the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Well, the ballot hadn't been expected until spring next year. Egypt's National Election Authority announced this week that the country would be holding its presidential vote in December amid its worst ever economic crisis. The vote is already fraught with accusations of repression. Rights groups say at least 35 opposition supporters have been arrested in recent months. With more on the election announcement, here's our correspondent in Cairo, Eduard Cousin.
So Egypt's National Election Authority announced that the presidential elections will be held on 10, 11 and 12 of December this year. And you see they go to great lengths to convince their audience these elections will be free, fair and transparent. And they hold two major press conferences in which they give detailed presentations about the precise process and procedures of these elections. So clearly it's very important for them that these elections are perceived as credible. And they want to convince the world and their own population that Egypt is a democracy and not a dictatorship. Previous elections in Egypt have actually drawn a lot of criticism for being quite the opposite of fair and free. President al-Sisi is in power since 2014 and was re-elected in 2018. During those elections, two potential challengers of Sisi were arrested and several others withdrew after being intimidated. The President Sisi has yet to announce his official candidacy for this election, but several other politicians have announced their candidacy. One of them is Ahmed al-Tantawi. He is a critic of the government and he said that he intends to run for these elections. However, 35 volunteers of his campaign have already been arrested in past weeks. Also, the National Election Authority, in their press conferences, issued some veiled threats towards journalists. They said that spreading rumors about the integrity of this election is a violation of the elections code and could actually constitute a crime.
Children in northwestern Syria are going back to school this month, but in some regions such as Idlib province, education is a luxury that many families can no longer afford. Displaced by war, half the population in the rebel-held area is living in abject poverty in crowded refugee camps. Some families feel they've had no choice but to send their children out to work. Aurore Dupuy has more.
Blacksmiths, carpenters, repairmen. These workers are not building a career path. They are children, desperate to feed their families. Sharif Barouk was 4 years old when the war broke out in Syria. He spent most of his life fleeing death and violence.
I used to go to school, but there were too many bombings. We had to run away from school to find shelter at home, but the bombings would resume the next morning, so I had to stop studying.
Since 2011, more than 1 million people have been displaced in the Idlib region in the northwest of the country. Many live in overcrowded camps under the poverty line with no access to public schools.
There's no money and very little work. Only 4 of my children go to school. That's costing me a lot of money. If education is interrupted, God forbid I'll be forced to send all my kids to work and they'll have to make a living wherever they can. But if I do that, I will have wasted their future.
The future seems brighter for families who can afford private education. Most are run by opponents to Bashar al-Assad's regime and are largely funded by parents themselves. In this school, tuition fees were reduced to allow as many children as possible to join classes from kindergarten to high school.
The discounts were significant, but living conditions here are extremely difficult. Even $5 or $10 are too much for families to fork out.
A ceasefire in the Idlib region was brokered 3 years ago, and the population is eager to see the reopening of its public schools.
For decades, authorities in Iraq have failed to properly manage water resources and infrastructure or regulate pollution and sewage, depriving millions of the right to safe drinking water. As river levels decrease amid scorching temperatures and fuel prices increase as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, activists say oil companies are doing little or nothing to limit their environmental impact and are exacerbating an already deteriorating situation. This report is from our correspondent, Charlotte Rupi, with Josh Vardy.
There is no river in Iraq that runs clean, that is, uncontaminated by plastic detritus, sewage or industrial waste. The Wadi al-Naft flows north of Kirkuk city. Its name, meaning Valley of Oil, is apt. This is where the state oil company North Oil dumps its waste.
It's a mixture of industrial and medical waste. We take samples from the upper layers and check the level of oil and grease. According to the law, the water should contain less than 10 milligrams per liter. Anything beyond that, we'll seek legal action.
The local environmental authorities accompanying him are all too familiar with the issue.
We took them to court and they were fined. This financial penalty can be from 1 million Iraqi dinars up to 10 million. It is to be paid monthly until the pollution is cleaned up.
The maximum fine is equivalent to just under 7,000 euros. The company pays, and the Wadi al-Naft continues to carry oil residues for more than 120 kilometers through 25 villages, where it's used by farmers.
This water is not good for irrigating tomatoes, cucumbers, or eggplants. It's bad for human health. But it's okay for wheat and corn. If the government helped us by digging wells, we would not use the valley.
Towards the south, the oil fumes coming off the water are replaced by a strong stench. Thousands of cubic meters of sewage are continually discharged into the Diyala River, which runs south of Baghdad before reaching the Tigris. Ibrahim and his family live on its banks.
There's no sewage network. All the houses in this neighbourhood dump their sewage directly into it. The neighbourhood next to ours dumps their rubbish into it. You can see the open sewer pipe here. Every 2 or 3 days, wastewater comes out of it.
What he's pointing to is the South Rustamia sewage treatment plant. The water that comes out of here should be clean, but its infrastructure dates from the 1980s and is no longer adapted to the population growth Baghdad's experienced in recent decades.
If the capacity of our plant is 175,000 cubic meters per day, in summer it will be working on treating between 250,000 and 300,000 cubic meters of wastewater. If the wastewater exceeds the capacity of our plant, there will be some overflow. Around 20 or 30% will be overflow.
Many of the pollutants in the water are not being filtered out. International investment has been promised to improve the situation, but with nothing yet done, residents are getting impatient.
All these children have respiratory allergies. This girl has a heart defect and the boy has meningitis. This one has asthma, and all the others here suffer from the pollution that they breathe.
In southern Iraq, these health risks are being monitored. The waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet here to form the Shatt al-Arab, bringing with them pollutants and bacteria.
Shatt al-Arab becomes the dump that collects all the waste, all the agricultural drainage from northern Iraq, even from Turkey. Diseases like colic and cholera are widespread.
This lab regularly tests the chemical composition of the river, the levels of heavy metals or oil in the water, and its biological composition in case of a health alert.
We mainly want to check E. coli, which is the evidence of pollution. It would mean the water is not good for human use, for cleaning or bathing. It's dangerous for human health.
In houses close to the city centre, residents take no risks. They're well aware the water pumped from the Shatt al-Arab into their homes is not safe.
I have to buy water and bottled water. Us adults take showers using tap water, but the kids don't, because we are worried about their health.
The Iraqi authorities refused thus entry into local hospitals to report on the situation there. Faced with the potential risk to public health, the country's Directorate of Infectious Diseases claims to be on constant alert to anticipate possible epidemics.
When water levels are high, it allows contaminated materials to be slightly diluted. But when water levels are down, it leads to a greater concentration of pollution. One of these contaminants causes cholera.
The United Nations estimates that Iraq will lose 20% of its water by 2025, considerably increasing the risk of pollution. Despite these warnings and the legal action taken against polluters, both private and public companies in the country continue to shirk their responsibilities.
Well, that's it for this week's edition of Middle East Matters. Stay with us for more world news here on France 24.
The Lampedusa harbour, about 100 kilometres from the African coastlines, is the first port of call for those fleeing their countries. But the maritime crossing is dangerous and often deadly.
Questo scenario terrificante, almeno 200 persone in mare che chiedevano aiuto, fra di loro c'erano già dei cadaveri che galleggiavano.
Survivors try to rebuild their lives. On a continent struggling to accommodate them.
Poi riportarli indietro, aiutarli nel loro paese a sta gente, perché poveri disgraziati non cosa devono fare.
Lampedusa Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Want to know? Find out here.
With France 24, learn to tell what's true from what's fake on social networks.
Identify the false rumours in European news stories.
Get reliable information about migration.
Truth or fake, every day we bring you information that is verified and put into context.
France 24 is news you can rely on every day across all platforms.